When we think about history, it's easy to get caught up in the big, famous events. But sometimes the real story, the real detective work, is about piecing together a single life from the little fragments that get left behind. So today, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're becoming historical detectives, and our one and only case is to reconstruct the life of a man named William Knapp, using nothing but the clues he left for us in the public record. The investigation starts now. So this is where it all begins for us, with the most solid fact we've got: a name and a date carved right into a gravestone in New Jersey. Think of this as our anchor, the one thing we know for sure. It's the final sentence in a very long story, and it tells us exactly where his journey ended. And that right there is the big question, isn't it? How do we possibly fill in the 81 years that led up to this single date? Well, we're going to approach this just like a detective on a cold case. We'll use census data, death records, even old newspaper clippings. All of it is evidence that's going to help us solve the puzzle of William Knapp. Okay, so with any good investigation, you start at the end, right? You work backwards from the last known facts. For William Knapp, that means kicking off our investigation right where his story ends, with the official record of his death. This document, this one piece of paper, is our first key piece of evidence. It's going to be the framework for his entire life. Okay, so check this out. This one document tells us so much. We get his age, 81, which means he was born right around 1775. We learn he was a shoemaker and that he was born in New York. All solid, concrete facts. But then you hit that last line, names of parents, and it's just blank. Uh-oh. Right away, we've got our first real mystery on our hands. So that blank space, that's our next big thread to pull. Who were his parents? This is where things start to get really tricky, because suddenly the evidence we have starts to contradict itself. On one hand, we've got official records from when he was alive, and on the other, we've got a very different story that was published 100 years later. And wow, the conflict here it's pretty glaring. On the left, you've got primary sources from William's actual lifetime, the census, his death certificate, and they both point to him being born around 1775. But then, on the right, you have this genealogy book from 1956 that claims he was born a full decade later, in 1786, to a specific couple. So you've got two totally different stories. Who do you believe? All right, as detectives on this case, we have to look at the evidence. And honestly, the choice is pretty clear. The records that were actually created while William was alive are just way more reliable than a book written 100 years after he died. The source material itself calls the book's claim surely erroneous. So for our investigation, we have to dismiss it. William Knapp's parentage, it's still an unsolved mystery. So his parents, that's a dead end for now, a total mystery. But the family he made? Well, that's a whole different story. Let's shift gears from the questions we can't answer to the facts we absolutely can, starting with William's role as the head of a really big and apparently thriving family. 11. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many children William and his wife, Sarah Cutter, had over about 25 years. But what's really incredible, especially for that time, is that every single one of those 11 kids survived to become an adult. That one number tells you so much about this family's resilience. What's so cool is that the census records are like these little time capsules of the Knapp household. In 1830, you can almost hear the chaos, right? A house packed with 9 people, 7 of them kids of all ages. Then jump ahead 10 years to 1840, and the nest is starting to empty out. And by 1850, it's a much quieter scene. Just William, now 75, his wife Sarah, and their 2 adult daughters still at home. It's a real human story told just through data. But see, William Knapp was way more than just a family man. The records paint this incredibly clear picture of a guy who was just deeply, deeply woven into the community of Newton, New Jersey. And get this quote comes from his daughter's obituary years after he was gone. It tells you everything you need to know about his reputation. It says he was one of the first settlers of Newton and that he had a very extensive acquaintance. He wasn't just some guy who lived there. He was part of the foundation of the town, a figure that everybody knew. I mean, look at all the different hats this guy wore. He was a craftsman, a shoemaker. He was a civic leader, serving as a justice of the peace for years. He was a man of faith, one of the first members of the Methodist Church there. And he was a community organizer, the treasurer for the local Masons. This wasn't just a man living in a town. This was a man building a town. And then you've got the old newspapers, which are like finding little snapshots of his life. It's amazing. So one minute, he's the victim of a pretty clever horse thief. The next, he's getting a public shout-out from a local store for being an amazing shoemaker. And a few years later, we see a real estate ad that puts him right on Spring Street. These aren't just facts. These are little scenes from his life.
Which brings us back to that number, 81. It's not just how long he lived. When you see everything he did, it's really a measure of his impact. 81 years of being a father, a craftsman, and a true pillar of his community, all captured in these old records.
All right, so our investigation is wrapping up. We've collected the evidence. We've followed all the clues we could find. Now it's time to step back and just look at the toolkit we used to put William Knapp's story back together. So if you look at our toolkit here, you can see how each piece of evidence gave us something different, but also had its own blind spots. The death record gave us the vital stats, but crucially not his parents. The census showed us the family growing and changing, but tells us nothing about what they were like. The newspapers gave us these amazing little slices of life, but not his own thoughts. And that's the reality of this work. No one source ever gives you the whole story. And really, that's just how this kind of work goes. We've managed to build this really rich, detailed portrait of William Knapp, the family man, the community builder, the shoemaker. We know so much more now than when we started with just that name on a gravestone. But we also have to be okay with the fact that some questions, like who his parents were, might just be lost to time forever.
And that kind of leaves us with one last question to chew on, doesn't it? We just spent all this time piecing a life together from census forms and old newspaper ads. One day, some historian in the future might try to do the exact same thing for us, only they'll be using our social media posts, our emails, our digital records. What story will the trail of fragments we all leave behind tell about us?